Hello and welcome back. It is a new day, a new sleigh, and a new video where I have something to say. Now, before anyone writes in the comments, I know everyone has made a Colleen Hoover video. Everyone has made a video like saying that she writes awful books. Why is this one any different? One of Colleen Hoover's most famous novels, that being It Ends With Us, is being turned into a movie which comes out August 9th of 2024. Now, us in the community, we've been know that Colleen Hoover is not necessarily known as someone that writes the best books with the best kind of content. Somehow, she zoomed to popularity and a lot of people really like her books. So this movie is bound to cause some kind of controversy or conversation, especially because the book itself has so much controversy around it. It Ends With Us is a romance, nothing too crazy, nothing too wild for Colleen Hoover. But the reason so many people talk about it is because It Ends With Us has an entire plot line surrounding abuse and domestic violence. In more recent years, as we've, come to our senses as readers, people have started calling out Colleen Hoover for making these kinds of books and really questioning her content and material that she puts into these romance books. People specifically criticize her for romanticizing these toxic relationships, saying that she doesn't know how to write a healthy relationship between two people. I thought to myself, what better way to prepare for this godforsaken movie's release than to take a hard look at the actual book. In this video, I will be doing a deep dive and a literary analysis into the actual book It Ends With Us. In part 1, I will be primarily discussing the plot. Part 2 will be more about the characters and their unique traits. Part 3 will be mainly focusing on the controversy and the problematic aspects of the book. Now, as is evident, I do have my own opinions on Colleen Hoover books, but I went into this read as objective as possible, looking at the plot, the writing style, and really picking out what works and what doesn't. It's easy to shit on Colleen Hoover. I just like to back it up with a little bit of evidence. Of course, a massive trigger warning for topics surrounding domestic violence and abuse. If you are sensitive to any of those topics, please click off the video. So without further ado, let's get into the video. As a spoiler-free summary, It Ends With Us is about our main character, Lily Bloom. I know. What a choice of a name. So the story takes place immediately after her father's funeral. She's living in Boston at this time, and she crosses paths with her love interest, that being Ryle Kincaid. The story then follows their, seemingly acquaintance relationship. They eventually get married and live their happily ever after, or so she thinks. As the story progresses, Lily finds out that Ryle is not the Prince Charming he presented himself to be. Ryle has quite the temper. He's very aggressive. Worst of all, he is incredibly abusive. So the rest of the story follows Lily as she tries to make this relationship work, and the book ends with her making a decision about whether or not she will stay or leave Ryle. So right from the beginning, there is a heavy lack of buildup between the relationship of Lily and Ryle. As I mentioned, when the book starts, Lily has just left her father's funeral and she makes her way to a random rooftop in Boston to get some fresh air. What she doesn't know is that she has found herself on the rooftop of Ryle's apartment building. So they have your pretty iconic manic pixie dream girl first meet, where Lily is super mysterious and therefore very sexy and enticing to Ryle. He takes a picture of her and then they part ways for the next 6 months. This book is littered with time jumps, and the purpose of these time jumps, which I'll get into later, is to show the slow progression of Ryle's abusive nature. It's meant to show that she doesn't know right from the get-go that Ryle has a potential for abuse, but I do take issue with the time jump right at the beginning, because we go from their meet cute to then Lily just living her life, being her single queen. At this point, Lily is opening up a flower shop because she is a gardener. She loves flowers. Could you have guessed? Her name is Lily Bloom. She hires this random girl that she finds off the street. So this employee that she hired off the street, surprise, surprise, is actually Ryle's sister. So that's how they run into each other again 6 months later. And now I really don't like this time jump because we're led to believe that Lily and Ryle have been thinking about each other for the entirety of the past 6 months, which I'm gonna say, Girl, how can you be dickmatized without the dick? How are you thinking about some dude that you ran into for probably all of like half an hour 6 months later? It's just like really hard for me as the reader to get into their love story because there's such a time jump between their initial meeting to when their relationship really kicks off. It would have been better if in the in-between we saw Lily like thinking about Ryle or like pining after him in some way. So it's hard for me as the reader to like really get down with their relationship because they had such a short meeting so long ago, and then once they get reacquainted with each other, it's like all of the passion is there, which I can understand. Again, like pure sexual attraction, like whatever, that's fine. I'm sure he's hot, but they make it seem like very like intimate and romantic, as if like she's like been thinking about him in a more like relationship sense versus like just pure sexual pleasure. There's not really a lot of build up for their relationship for me to really believe that she's been down bad for some random dude that she met 6 months ago. Another thing that I didn't necessarily like from a literary perspective is Atlas's journals. So throughout the book, as we are getting our present day POV from Lily, she's also reading her old journals from when she was a teenager, and specifically when she first met Atlas. Atlas is her other love interest in this book, and he's a boy that she met when she was like 15. And at the time he was homeless, so she was like bringing food to him, like helping him out. And they had like a nice like friendship that eventually turned into a relationship that eventually turned into nothing. Honestly, I didn't expect to come out of this review with anything positive to say about the book, but I will say I liked, from a literary perspective, the way that the Atlas journals were written. It conveys a lot more emotion and a lot more character from Lily, honestly, even more than like her present day self. I don't necessarily like the implementation of these journals because, again, their main use is to make the reader fall in love with Atlas without ever really meeting him present day. It's to give us that like exposition and, you know, why Lily and him had such like a good relationship when they did. You know, from a narrative perspective, she really has no reason to read these journals, which I get. Nostalgia, you know, you go through your stuff, you find an old journal, you flip through it, of course, which I get the first time. The first time is the day after her father's funeral and she's going through her stuff, which again, they never really say why she did that, but I was willing to like suspend my disbelief. But then she still goes through and reads these journals like it's her assigned reading from an English class. So from a narrative perspective, I didn't necessarily understand or like grasp why Lily had to read these journals. From like the reader's perspective, I think that they're a great addition to the actual narrative, but I'm not seeing why Lily was actually reading them. And I will say, after she finishes the Atlas journals and when we actually meet him, he's not really a part of the narrative as much. He's very secondary. So I didn't necessarily like that. I would have liked if he had more of a presence in the novel after his journals are done. Like, it was great in terms of the writing, and I really liked it because in those journals we see more of like her conflicting feelings, being like a secondary victim to domestic violence, and like how it conflicts with her feelings for her mother. Because in these journals, I'm sorry, I didn't specify. In these journals, she's talking about her home life because her father was actually abusive towards her mother. So we're getting her firsthand account and how that's impacted her personally, and all those very like raw and negative feelings that she has about the situation. There's a lot of really, really good parts in those journals. I just wish we had a better reason for why they were included in the book. I just think like from the layout and the flow of the narrative, they're just very awkwardly placed in there. The fact that all the journals were written as like Dear Ellen letters is just so very Manic Pixie Dream Girl. Honestly, her whole like, oh my god, writing in a journal is so cringe, so I'm just gonna make this a letter, is the exact same intro as Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Be original. I'm not saying that I wish the journals weren't included. I just wish we had a better reasoning for why Lily was going through them, because it's literally just like her present day chapter and then all of a sudden we're in the journals, but we really have no reason for why Lily is reading them, like why we are getting this as the reader. I can understand the value in having that in the book. I wish like it was explained more in a narrative sense, especially because I think it like perfectly juxtaposes Lily's current situation with her old self and how she felt about domestic violence. Because in her Dear Ellen journals, we see her father, again, from Lily's perspective. We only ever see see the worst parts of him. The times where he's being incredibly abusive, not only to Lily, but to her mother. But then we jump to her present day where she's spending time with Ryle. She's having these good experiences. She's feeling all of those good feelings that come with a first love. We see him for a full year of him acting like quote unquote normal before he even starts showing any abusive tendencies. It helps us understand how the situation escalated and how Lily couldn't see the similarities until it was too late. But again, I know like from a plot perspective, the reason that we're getting this before we meet Atlas is so that we as the reader fall in love with his character before we actually even meet him. So that when we do, we can understand that he's going to have some kind of rivalry with Ryle in terms of winning over Lily's affection. In Lily's current relationship with Ryle, we see him for a full year before he starts exhibiting any abusive tendencies towards her. So we kind of see like a cognitive dissonance. Again, I'll talk about it more once I go into her character analysis, where she's seeing him exhibit the exact same behaviors that she's seen throughout her entire childhood. But for her, it's a little harder for her to imagine herself in that situation because, again, through her journals, we only ever see her father at his worst. She's had so many more good experiences with Ryle at this point compared to bad, so she assumes that it's not the same. And again, I love that that is a reason that the journals are there, to juxtapose and really give us an insight to how like Lily's brain is functioning and specifically the cognitive dissonance that she's feeling in this scenario. I just wish that there was a better reasoning that we had these journals. And I have other problems with the journals, but I'll go into them more later. But from a literary perspective, they're just not like rationalized very well in a narrative perspective. The next big thing I have with this book that I just hate so much is the Emerson rationale. So after the second time Ryle puts his hands on Lily, he pushes her down a flight of stairs and then tries to convince her that she fell. So at this point, Lily is like, okay, I'm done. We're done. I'm not doing this again. After the fact, Ryle's sister, Elisa, which is again, Lily's employee and her now best friend, tells Ryle, hey, why don't you tell her about your childhood trauma so that she can understand why you threw her down a flight of stairs. So this rationale is that apparently when Ryle was 6 years old, he accidentally shot his older brother Emerson, and it's really taken a toll on him mentally, in which he gets so angry that he blacks out and doesn't know what he's doing. So I have many an issue with this rationale because A, it's being used to explain why he's abusive to Lily, which from a literary perspective just isn't true. It's a false statement. At first when I read it, I was like, oh, this is just his like, narcissistic behavior. He's just deflecting. He's just trying to make it seem like, oh, I have trauma and that's why I threw you down a flight of stairs. But we're not, as the reader, we're not supposed to really put any like merit to his statement. That's what I thought. No, that's not what Colleen Hoover wanted us to think. This is supposed to be a very accurate reason as to why Ryle is abusive as a person. From a narrative perspective, it's just not really developed. This is like the first time Ryle mentions this. It's halfway through the book. And then when he tells Lily about it, they ask us to recall a moment from the beginning, the first chapter of this book, in which he says, oh yeah, I had a bad day because I'm a neurosurgeon and some kid came into the ER and he accidentally shot his brother. We don't know it at the time, but the reason he was so upset is because he did the same thing when he was a kid. So they're asking us to call back halfway through the book, this one throwaway scene. And then from this point, it's never mentioned ever again. First of all, not to mention, he also says that he is going to therapy at this point, and then the therapy never comes up again afterwards. So I have to assume he lied. For one thing, it's definitely not working out for him if he's still doing what he's doing. It's made to seem like it's this really big trauma for him and that it really impacts his day-to-day life, and then it's never mentioned again. It's like alluded to, and honestly, Lily seems to think about it more than Ryle ever does. So I hate this narratively because it's just like such like a throwaway. Like they want you to believe that it's like such like a major life-changing event for Ryle, and then homeboy never talks about it, literally ever. This is the only time he actually really gets down and open about what he's experienced. And I won't necessarily speak to the relationship between experiencing a childhood trauma, like that specific trauma and how it manifests, because trauma and its side effects can manifest in a lot of different ways. So if that experience causes him to have essentially like bursts of anger and blackout because of it, I won't testify to the reality or like how true that is, because I'm not a mental health professional. But as I will talk about later on in the book, he specifies that he blacks out, meaning he's not conscious when he's abusing Lily. And that, my friends, is not the case, but I will talk about it later. I will now move on to one of the biggest crimes against humanity. After Ryle abuses Lily for a third time, she decides to call it quits. She has Atlas help her escape, take her to the hospital to treat her wounds. At this hospital, she then finds out that she is pregnant. I think that this plot is very unrealized and underdeveloped overall. Personally, as a reader, I don't necessarily like when books include like, oh, character is pregnant as a conflict in the story. It's not my favorite, especially when those characters never consider any other options besides having the baby. But that's more personal, so I won't get into that. I will instead get into the fact that she never really like talks about it. I wish she would have talked more about how the baby will now factor into her decisions, because at the end of the book, her decision to either stay or leave Ryle is very heavily motivated on her child, because she's a mother now. She has to do what is best for her child. From the start, when she's pregnant, when she finds out, we don't really dwell on her feelings about it too much. She expresses like a general like, oh yeah, I'm happy to have a kid, but we never really see how it affects her. Of course, like it is a conflict in just that like she is now pregnant with her abuser's baby, but also how it affects her decisions, how it affects her mentally, that now even though she tried to leave Ryle, in a way she's tethered to him for the rest of her life, for the rest of that baby's life. So for me personally, it does feel very like shock value-y, very much like, oh, we need to throw in a wrench in her plans, like something that's just done for the plot. And I really don't like that, because again, I feel like it's just very underdeveloped, because the namesake of the book and towards the end where like her baby is the contributing factor to whether or not she stays or leaves Ryle, you would think that the baby would play a much more prominent role, especially with her inner dialogue. I just wish we got more of her like really thinking about it. I thought that when she found out that she was pregnant, it would have really like forced her as a character to think about the things that she has been putting herself through by like explaining away Ryle's abuse, trying to cover it up, actively trying to convince herself that she's not going through the same things that her mother was going through. Now that she's pregnant, that she has to really like take a hard look at herself. And again, not to say that any victims are like in any way culpable for the things that they go through or that they're to blame, but just to really like think about what decisions she is going to have to make now that she is making them for another human being. Especially because, again, with the Atlas journals, in that perspective, it's her as a child, it's her experiencing the abuse as just being someone in the same household. We see how much it's affected her, especially with her relationship with her mom and her dad. So I would imagine that as she's now recognizing that she is falling into the same cycle as her mother, that this baby and the existence of this baby would play a more prominent role in her decision making. But honestly, there's so many times where the baby is just like not mentioned or like very like secondary to her like inner dialogue. Honestly, we get more of the book where it's like her and Elisa and they're like, oh yay, yippee, we're both pregnant at the same time, our kids are gonna be friends, let's plan the baby shower, and it's all like, yay, pregnancy is the best thing that can happen to a woman, which is neither here nor there. But I wish that they like really developed on it, especially because at some point Lily tells her mother A, that she is pregnant, and B, that Ryle has been abusive towards her. So I would have really enjoyed if they took that time that she has with her mother for her to really ask like how having a kid impacted her decision making, because her mom like really talks about how it was like for her when she first started in her relationship with Lily's dad and how it progressed and eventually spiraled out of control. But they never really talk about how Lily contributed to her her overall decision making and like how it impacted her like general life and why she still decided to stay with Lily's dad even after she was born. We never really like discussed the impact of Lily's existence and how it contributed to like the overall dynamic of her mom and her dad, and then how that could indirectly pass down to Lily and Ryle once they have their kid. We never get any of that. So I just feel it's so underdeveloped and they really like drop the ball with this. This baby is definitely used just as like a conflict, a shock value, which narrative wise is lazy. And I also don't like, especially towards the end of the book, when she starts like quote unquote making amends with Ryle. You really get the sense that when she's in it with Ryle, that she is like not necessarily being truthful. She's kind of an unreliable narrator in which she's talking about her situation and she's really like denying that she's in an abusive relationship. And then even after the fact, we see her kind of like explaining away Ryle's behaviors and even like misremembering her own past and her own trauma. And she keeps saying like, oh, my dad was a good person. He had his good moments and he did love me. Throughout her entire journals, we never get a moment in which he seems like a human being. There's one moment in which her father shows any kind of behavior that is not abusive. And that's literally, he comes home, he eats a cookie, and he says, wow, you baked a nice cookie. That's it. And that is the only moment in which we see him act like a human being. And that is the crumbs that they give us and the whole reasoning that Lily has for him being a good person, because he complimented her on a cookie. Like, Lily keeps telling us that her dad was a good person and had his good moments, but they never show us said moments. So this is a classic like show don't tell. Show me that he was a good person. Give me a scene. Give me anything more than the crumbs you're throwing at me, Colleen Hoover. So narrative wise, it's just very like lacking. And of course, the ending is so incredibly rushed. There was so much buildup at the beginning of the story, and pacing wise, I wasn't even upset. Like it was okay. We had like a good rhythm going. And then the end is like she goes from like, I don't know about you, Ryle, to they're living together in the same house. He's cooking her breakfast and kisses her on the forehead. There was even a line, and I wasn't going to bring this up, but I would literally, like, I would never live with myself if I never mentioned this. There's a part in this last chapter where Lily wakes up and she's like, I smell toast. Ryle knows it's my favorite. And then it's actually Ryle making her toast. And I'm like, do we not see the irony? Is that not like funny? Because the last time she said those exact words about Ryle making her toast in the morning is the morning after she escaped him, the morning after she had to literally leave in the middle of the night, in the darkness of night, after he tried to R-word her, headbutted her so hard that her head split open, and then she found out she was pregnant with his child. She wakes up the next morning to Atlas making her breakfast and says the very same line. And there is no callback and there's no reference. There's not even like a split second where she's like, oh my God, I thought this exact same thing when I actually escaped him. There's no irony there. And I don't think that was on purpose. I think we're supposed to be like, oh, hee, cute, he's making her toast. So this last chapter literally is them like seemingly back together, happily ever after. Really, like, honestly, another thing I hate about the baby thing is that it's supposed to be like the deciding factor in her decision, and yet we never really have an inkling about what she'll choose. And Colleen does that on purpose because her whole thing is she was like, oh no, it's supposed to be like plot twisty, it's supposed to be plot twisty, boo. No. Get out of here. So that last chapter is literally her being happily married couple with Ryle. No qualms about that for some reason. And then she's rushed to the hospital, gives birth in record time, probably sneezed and birthed that baby out. And then she decides, no, it ends with us. Ryle, I can't stay with you. We are getting divorced. The end. So from a plot perspective, there's a lot of like inconsistencies, and I'll get more into it when I like go into their characters, but they were trying to juggle like so many serious topics, and personally I think it might have accomplished a little bit more if we took out the sex scenes. If we just like, God forbid, had a serious thought for a minute that didn't involve like toe licking, because that's in the book, maybe we could have accomplished more with what we were trying to say. Colleen Hoover has said in the past that her books are mainly for entertainment purposes. She doesn't write to persuade, tell a message, or anything like that, but that this book is different, that she specifically had something to say about domestic violence. So you would think that, I don't know, me personally, if I wanted to say something serious and actually like say something worthwhile about trauma and domestic violence, I would put the toe licking away. Me personally, I don't know, maybe that's a crazy hot take. We had a nice pace at the beginning, but the ending is incredibly rushed, which I didn't like. There's a lot of like narrative kind of holes and things that are just like patched onto the plot to make it work, and overall it's just not very good. Now, on to the characters, starting with Ryle. Ryle Kincaid, aka the embodiment of had a daughter, became a feminist. First of all, Ryle is incredibly creepy. So Ryle took a picture of Lily the night that they first met, which at this point in the book has been like over 6 months ago. And Lily finds out that he has a picture, like that picture of her, he took of her, put it on a massive canvas and hung it in his apartment. And that's supposed to be romantic. If that happened to me, I would literally cry. I would change my name, change my identity, and go into witness protection. That's crazy. There's also a point in which he goes to her apartment and knocks on every single door until he finds her apartment, because he doesn't know her apartment number and he only vaguely knows the apartment building because she pointed it out the first night they met each other 6 months ago. Bangs on every door, finds her door, and then begs her to have sex with him, and it's supposed to be romantic and sweet or whatever, which I will extend the benefit of the doubt that maybe Colleen Hoover threw this in so that we as the reader could be lulled into a false sense of security, and all these touch-starved bitches could say, oh my god, that's so romantic. But really, all of our mega brains over here are supposed to be thinking, this is a warning sign, he's actually abusive. But Lily doesn't know that, and so many of the readers don't know that because we're too caught up in the romance of it. I'll extend the benefit of the doubt, even though I think I'm giving her too much credit. Because I'm sorry, banging on a door like a beta in Heat is supposed to be romantic and appealing to me? No. I definitely think that his character perpetuates a certain idea where it's like men can get away with a certain amount of stuff if they're hot enough. I also think that this book is very much inspired by Grey's Anatomy. Ryle is a neurosurgeon with a dark past or whatever. Lily is like dark and twisty and has a bad relationship with a father figure. All I'm gonna say is that when you picture Ryle, neurosurgeon Ryle, you think you're gonna get Derek Shepherd at that door, right? You think you're gonna get McDreamy. But if you get that other neurosurgeon banging on your door saying, please have sex with me, you would call the police, is all I'm gonna say. These Colleen Hoover fans will let anything go if you're hot enough. This is before the abuse actually starts to like really take hold in this relationship. Then during and / after the abuse, quote unquote, Ryle is made to seem like his abuse is just, pure bursts of anger attributed to his trauma, and that A, he can't control it, and B, doesn't realize he's doing it. Again, referencing that he blacks out, which he says himself that he blacks out and doesn't realize what he's doing. So again, and this ties in a little bit more to my critiques of the plot, but we're meant to believe that Ryle is not in control and that he doesn't actually know he's abusing Lily when it happens. But this all gets thrown away the third time Ryle abuses Lily. At this time, Elisa has just given birth and Lily is coming home. Ryle has already been home for a while and he is waiting for Lily. He has read a news article about the best new businesses in Boston, one of them being Atlas's. Atlas is the owner / chef at a restaurant called Bibs, and in this newspaper article he talks about the reason he named it Bibs, which stands for Best in Boston, or Better in Boston, I'm sorry, which is a reference to something he told Lily, and he even says that it was inspired by a girl. So Ryle goes through all of Lily's journals and finds a magnet that she has on their fridge that says Better in Boston, and he makes the connection. He's like, oh my god, you're cheating on me with Atlas. You actually love him. Why do you have his stuff in our apartment? He's waiting for Lily to come home, and he is revealing to her that he knows all of this about Atlas, that he went through all of her stuff, but it's not like a conversation that he has with her, no. Now there is an article that I saw that talked more in depth about this. Let me pull it up. So this is from the article written by domesticshelters.org, specifically criticizing It Ends With Us, so I'll read it now. The third incident, however, reveals Ryle to be sadistic, premeditating, and cruel. It is not an example of a poor, tortured soul who loses control. On the contrary, it's a chilling portrayal of a calculated and violent attack. Ryle discovers Lily has kept a small gift, a refrigerator magnet given to her by her high school boyfriend. This enrages him with jealousy, and when she returns home that evening, he is waiting for her in the dark, holding the magnet. He initiates a sexual encounter with Lily, and while digitally her with one hand and pulling her hair to the point of pain with the other, demands she tell him who gave her the magnet. This is frightening and humiliating for Lily, but she is too afraid to disobey. What follows is a R-word attempt that results in multiple physical injuries, including a scream-inducing bite and a headbutt that knocks Lily unconscious. Throughout the attack, Ryle is disturbingly calm. So what we know from this specific incident in the book is that this was premeditated. This was not a blackout because, again, Ryle is waiting for her when she comes home. This is not like a burst of anger because it's very much drawn out, where he lulls her into a false sense of security, he engages her in sexual activities, and he continuously tries to hurt her and scare her even when she asks him to stop and tells him that he's hurting her. We can also tell that it's premeditated because, again, he read through the entire newspaper, he kept it, and he then read through all of Lily's journals because we see them strewn out all over their bed. It's also disturbing because when Ryle tries to R-word her, he says that he just hasn't shown her how much he loves her, and that his abuse will show her that. So all of this is not just a burst of anger. It's not even a temper tantrum, and it is definitely not a blackout as the book tried to tell us. Ryle's character is meant to be like, oh, tortured guy with inner demons that he has to battle for the love of his life, right? His inner demons are meant to be portrayed as something that he can't necessarily control. But we see so often after he abuses Lily or does anything to her that he tries to explain away what he did. We see him recognize that his behavior is bad, but he still tries to cover it up and, literally gaslight her. Again, the second time when Ryle pushes her down the stairs, he tries to convince her that she fell. He's recognizing that he did something to her, something bad enough that he should lie about it. That's not a blackout. That's not him not knowing what he's doing. It's premeditated. It's him being completely conscious of the abuse he's inflicting on her. So immediately his whole character tortured soul with inner demons thing doesn't work. The narrative explanation goes to shit. His whole character motivations and the fact that we're supposed to root for him goes to shit. None of it has any merit. None of it actually matters because when you look at his actual actions, they don't line up. I also don't like narrative wise because we only ever focus on the sadness he feels. Every single time we see Ryle after this incident, after Lily leaves him, he's portrayed as a sad puppy. Oh, little sad little puppy, he doesn't know that pissing on the carpet is bad. That's literally how we're meant to see him. He constantly weaponizes her sexual pleasure because he knows that if he lowers her inhibitions, that he can exert control and force her to stay with him. Because literally, their first reunion after she leaves him, he tries to kiss her and move her towards the bed, and it's literally only the trauma and panic attack that she has afterwards that brings her to her senses and is forces her to push him off her. It says so abundantly that he's a bad person and that he's doing it on purpose and he knows what he's doing is bad but continues to do it. So overall, he's just he's not a good character. He's not a person with inner demons or past traumas or things that he's working through, because we see so often that his inner demons or whatever, that he can't control it is just not true. So his whole character explanation is all whatever, the fact that we're supposed to get to know him when he's not a bad person, and then when he is a bad person we're supposed to give him the benefit of the doubt, is so stupid. And then worst of all, Lily has to literally tell him, what if it was your daughter, for him to finally understand that abusing women is bad. Ryle understands the dangers he has to protect his daughter from because he is the danger. And honestly, he's the worst version of it. He knows how people think. He knows how men can manipulate women because he is the master of it. The fact that he had to learn, that Lily had to literally teach him, what if someone hurt this little baby? You wouldn't like that, right? And he was like, no, you're right. Hitting women is bad. I am a feminist starting now. That's ridiculous. And the fact that we're supposed to root for that character arc for Ryle, oh my God, my standards are so much higher than that, and my standards are on the floor. So overall, Ryle Kincaid, the embodiment of a red flag. He has no kind of redeeming qualities. He's a bad person through and through, despite the narrative's insistence that he's a good person with inner demons. Moving on to Lily. I will preface, because I do have to preface this, there is no perfect victim. I can recognize that. She is not a perfect person, and neither do I expect her to be. The criticisms that I have are specifically on the writing of her character, and they cannot in any way be applied to real life people. So let's get that out of the way first. Okay. Lily's character arc is dependent on her realizing that she cannot, quote unquote, control Ryle's anger and prevent her abuse from happening. She has to make this decision not only for herself, but for her baby. As I mentioned earlier, I thought her thought process and the things that she was going through at the beginning of the story were meant to portray her as an unreliable narrator. She's rationalizing the abuse that she's going through, and she's kind of like excusing Ryle's behaviors. And I thought we were supposed to believe that that's not true, that Lily is not necessarily understanding the full extent of the situation that she's in, and that we as the reader are not supposed to put any merit to her rationale. We as the reader are supposed to recognize that what Ryle is doing is wrong, and that Lily's, reasoning or anything that she says in terms of like explaining his anger or trying to avoid it from happening is not meant to actually be of any importance. We're supposed to recognize that you can't explain why someone is abusive. There's no reasoning for it, and there's nothing that can ever explain why someone would put their hands on you. After she leaves Ryle, we're supposed to see a transition where she comes to terms with her situation, but it never really happens. First of all, she has this idea, this fallacy, that someone that loves you can hurt you. Even after the fact, after Ryle literally put a hole in her skull, she thinks that he loves her, which I can say, Ryle probably thinks he loves her, but he's also an abuser. He's not in his right sense of mind, love. So he probably believes that he really truly does love her. But I think that it's not necessarily a good thing to portray by having her say that like she actually thinks he loves her, or that people that love you can hurt you. And I say that in like the physical sense, that like someone that loves you could also put their hands on you and physically hurt you on purpose. And I don't know if I can say too much about this, but I can definitely say someone who loves you will definitely not put their hands on you, and they will absolutely not do it multiple times or on purpose. She also suddenly has like a massive change of heart about her dad because she realizes the similarities between Ryle and her dad. From the beginning of the story, we get like, oh, I hate my dad, to the point where she says for his eulogy, I'm gonna say all the good things about my dad. And then she says nothing. That's what she said at his literal funeral. Amazing move on her part. Literally queen behavior. So we go from that. We go from all this resentment she has towards her dad to suddenly, my dad was a good person. He did love me. He just didn't know how to show me. From a plot perspective, from a writing perspective, we see no transition. The only reason she has a change of heart about her dad is because she suddenly realizes, oh my God, my dad and Ryle are the same person. They're both incredibly abusive and hate their wives. But I love Ryle, so therefore I love my dad. We never see her confront her own false reasoning. We never see her really like think to herself like, oh man, I really tried to explain away the things Ryle was doing to me, and that just wasn't true. There's so many instances throughout the book where she blames herself or, other outside factors for what Ryle did. For example, she blames herself for not throwing away Atlas's phone number because maybe if she did, Ryle wouldn't have thrown her down the stairs. And then she's like, oh, maybe I should have let Ryle leave when he wanted to, and maybe he wouldn't have thrown me down the stairs. We never see her confront her own false ideas that she in any way had the power to avoid the abuse that happened to her. Which again, if she was meant to be an unreliable narrator, if we were not really supposed to put any merit to her reasoning and rationale and the things that she was thinking while she was experiencing the abuse from Ryle, then we should have seen that undone. We should have seen her go back and think about all the things that she was doing and all the rationales and really like come face to face and say that was wrong. Like, that's not true. I was trying to make it work and I can't. Which again, for a book that's supposed to be written for women that experience domestic violence, it's crucial to say in the narrative, in the book, that these reasonings, these rationales aren't true. You can't do anything to avoid abuse from an abusive person because it's not your fault. It's not your responsibility. But it's Colleen Hoover's responsibility to make this evident in the book, which she didn't. I will say that the first time Lily meets Ryle again after she leaves him for the first time, there is great commentary where she tells him, like, even if she was cheating on him with Atlas, that he would have had no right, no reasoning to put his hands on her. And overall, Colleen Hoover does make good commentary about how, as a society, we tend to blame women for not leaving, and we don't put any of the blame on the actual abusers in the situation. And all of that is delivered through Lily's like inner monologue. So I will say, as a character, she's able to recognize all these like nuances that come with domestic violence. But then Lily still believes that Ryle is blacking out when he abuses her and that he is not in control of his own emotions. When they first, talk to each other after she tries leaving him the first time, Ryle goes over to talk to her but brings their friend Marshall to like intervene if he tries to hurt her again. And Lily, feels bad for Ryle. She says something along the lines of like, oh my God, it must be so awful, quote, to have absolutely no control over your emotions. Throughout the book, Lily sees Ryle's anger as like a separate entity. When he's angry, it's not Ryle, it's his anger. He's like being possessed by a demon, literally. And maybe this is a personal thing, but I just personally believe that the only way you can control and regulate your emotions is to acknowledge that they are a part of you. So the fact that she, even to any degree, still believes that he cannot control his anger, and it also just ignores the fact that it's a pattern of behavior that he has. So to say that like he's not in control or that like his anger is like a separate entity that like possesses him is so ridiculous. I also don't like it because while Lily is pregnant, she just like loses any kind of sense of autonomy. There's a point in which she paints the nursery for the baby, right? And her mom is busy and Elisa is busy, and she's like, oh man, well I can't be by myself, so let's call Ryle. She calls Ryle to look at her mural of the nursery. Why? Because she wants someone to look at it. She just can't function by herself as a human being, I guess. Need I remind you that before this, she was a girl boss businesswoman living on her own, doing her thing. And then when Ryle comes in, he's wearing scrubs, which you would think is not important, but earlier on, before he becomes, physically abusive towards Lily, his scrubs are her weakness. She thinks they're so uber sexy and attractive. So now, after the fact that Ryle has physically abused her on more than one occasion, split open her skull, threw her down a flight of stairs, tried to R-word her, she sees him in his scrubs and she says, damn, he's wearing scrubs. And it's supposed to be like, oh man, my one weakness, I'm still horny. What? Are you joking? Again, just reiterating that Ryle is hot and therefore forgivable for any wrongdoings. It's so cheap that they put that right in the middle of like a really tense scene. Again, she is now alone in an apartment with her abuser. And the first thing she thinks of is, damn, he's wearing scrubs and that he's hot? What a way to cheapen any substantial statements we were trying to make about domestic violence. They also, in this scene, have like a whole conversation. They really like get down to the nitty gritty about, her back and forth about whether or not she wants to stay with Ryle, how it'll impact them now that they have a child together. She says, quote, I don't even believe it was intentional when you hurt me. She's a victim, and it's okay to take a while to process what you go through. But then she also says that her father only hit her mom and that she doesn't believe Ryle will hit their child because her dad only ever hit her mom. And this is supposed to be a real thing. Like, it's not supposed to be like, oh, hee hee ha ha. This is a trauma response. She's not actually thinking like in any kind of logical real way. This is her actual real life reasoning, which is just straight up wrong. Because A, her father did hurt other people besides her mom. There's a scene in which she tells us in her Dear Ellen letters that her father threw her down onto the ground and split her skull open. So That's her mom and Lily. And then when her dad found out that she was having relations with Atlas, he beat him with a baseball bat to the point where she thought he died. So that's Lily's mom, Lily, and Atlas. And those are only the 3 people she talks about. So that's just a straight up lie. So for her to say like, oh, well, you're like my dad, and my dad didn't hurt anyone besides my mom, so like, I think you're okay, is A, just wrong, B, has no merit in this conversation and doesn't really say anything about whether or not Ryle could and ever would hit their own child, and C, also implies that like, oh, well, if you only ever hit me, then that's okay. Huh? Are you joking? That's a real reasoning? So, at the end of the book, Lily decides that they will be getting a divorce, but she chooses to allow Ryle to have visitation and, play a role in their daughter's life, which I won't say too much about that decision, but I will say that it's heavily inspired by Colleen Hoover's own life. Colleen Hoover, in her author's note, specifies that her mother was also in an abusive relationship, that her mother eventually decided to leave her father, but that, they still visited him and he still played a role in her life. So I think the ending is very heavily inspired by what happened to her in real life, and that's what we're getting here. So overall, I think Lily's character just kind of falls apart. She comes across as like very strong at the beginning, not just like in terms of like who she is, but just like her character's presence in the story. We know like who she is, her morals and values, but then it all kind of unravels. And again, most of it, I have to say, is because Ryle is hot. I would have liked if it was addressed in the book that some of the things that Lily was saying and thinking while she was like in the thick of her abuse was not like real, or that she was like, it was just her own trauma. To have her really confront her own ways of thinking, but it never happens. Her character is essentially wasted and becomes nothing more than, I can fix him. And now moving on to the controversy. The problem with this book and what people took issue to is its portrayal of domestic violence, which ironically is also what people loved about it. Again, we have to consider that this book is very different from all the other Colleen Hoover books because this one is meant for a specific message and it's meant to, say something greater than just, for entertainment purposes. Her audience is primarily women, and for this book, women who have experienced DV. So we have her purpose and we have her audience. Let's go over the message she was trying to deliver with this book. An alarming message I found was that there is no such thing as bad people, only people that do bad things. It's not a message that I disagree with in any way because I did cover it a little bit in my review of A Silent Voice, but the application in this story is meant to force us to see Ryle in a holistic way, to see him as more than an abuser. The difference between bad people and people that do bad things is one very important factor, that being change. We as people are ever changing, and this statement highlights that our past actions do not define us as long as we are willing to change. Ryle never changes. In fact, he changes for the worst. His change is prompted by Lily physically taking herself out of the relationship so he literally can't get to her, and by him having a kid. His motivation for change is not in any way intrinsic, and it is definitely not by choice. The only reason he decides to change is that so he can have some kind of role in his child's life. The message of this book also tells women that they need to put aside their own feelings and experiences with an abusive partner for the sake of their child. Also from the article that I referenced earlier on in the video, when talking about Lily's decision to co-parent with Ryle, Lily ultimately decides that, quote, parents have to work through their differences and bring a level of maturity into a situation in order to do what's best for their child. But Ryle is not a guy who simply has differences with his child's mother, a disagreement about allotted screen time or a number of hours spent in daycare. He's a dangerous criminal with a history of manipulating and victimizing a woman. Lily's decision to co-parent with Ryle is not redemptive. It's a blatant shirking of the barest parental responsibility, the responsibility to protect her daughter. Because again, with that big conversation that Lily and Ryle have together, what she takes away is that, oh, I don't want to take away your rights as a father. It's your right to have a role in our child's life. I take issue with this specifically because there's no guarantee that Ryle won't hit their child just because she thinks that he would only ever hit her, first of all, is a wild statement. And on top of the fact that you don't even know that for sure. Because it's also just like contradicts her previous statement that like, oh, Ryle is not in control of his anger, that he's blacking out. Because it says to a certain degree that he can control his anger enough to only ever hit Lily and not hit their child, but that he's still somehow so like not in control of his anger, and that's why he's hitting Lily. So it's just like so many contradicting things that go into his character, which I won't say is a reflection on Colleen Hoover's own relationship and feelings with her father. That is not for me to say. I will say, however, that I think from a narrative perspective, it's messy. I don't know if you're trying to tell me that Ryle is a good person or not, because any reasoning or rationale, good points for the argument that he is a good person don't even like measure up. They're constantly contradicted in the actual book. And I think there is a greater, conversation to be had about like her initial reasoning that like, oh, I have to protect my child. I have to do what's best for my child. And then her still thinking that the best for her child is to have an abusive father figure in her life. Someone that we know has a history of being manipulative, which if someone, an individual makes that decision, that's one thing, right? But to put this book out into the world, to say that it's for women, that it's for women who are victims of DV, and to then push that message that that is the best choice for you, no. Literally no. Because even if Colleen were to say like, no, everyone can make their own choices, like this is not like to say that every woman should choose to have their abusive partner stay in their children's life, I think it can indirectly have that effect, especially with like the narrative and almost like guilt that Lily kind of pushes in her reasoning that like, oh, I would feel guilty if I didn't have Ryle a part of this child's life, or I would feel guilty if I didn't give him the opportunity to have a child. It's so heavily laced with like guilting women, and I hate that. I think it's awful to have that as a message. And overall, for the book to end with Lily essentially going to Ryle and saying, Ryle, this isn't you. Look at me. This isn't you, is absolutely awful. I think this book could have been good. It could have said a lot of great commentary about domestic violence, and there were times where it did. But the overall delivery of the message, again, not really agreeing with itself about who Ryle is and if he's a redeemable character, is a major reason why the book falls apart. It's so up in the air, it's so flip-floppy, and worst crime of all, it's explained away because he's hot. Overall, I think this book just really missed the mark, partly because she tried so hard to like make it like big plot twist that he's abusive actually, and the fact that she still tried to play into her other writing styles, that being that she put in a lot of like sex scenes and a lot of like very intimate stuff. So I feel like it did kind of take away from the overall message, because that valuable toe sucking time could have gone to developing more on these characters and their inner battles as they kind of like try to think about like what they want out of their lives and the decisions they have to make. Overall, I give this book a 1 out of 5. I actually give it a 0 out of 5. I would not recommend anyone reading this book. I would not recommend anyone watching the movie. I think it's also interesting because there's so many Goodreads reviews where people were saying like, oh my god, I wish like there were so many times I wish that like Colleen Hoover would just like delete what she made Ryle do and that we could just go back, and I wanted to give him a hug, and he was just so like, oh, I just wish he wouldn't do those bad things. And to that, I say, disrespectfully, get up, get off your goddamn knees, and put them to the floor of a church. Jesus Christ. Because again, the build-up at the beginning where we're supposed to like him, I hated him. Nothing about him is redeeming. Everything we know about him from the beginning is just that he is a beta male in heat. He's not a good person. He is just hot and horny. And that is the reason we're supposed to root for him. That's the reason we're supposed to feel some kind of conflict about whether or not Lily should stay with him. Which I think sacrificing your overall message to have a character that's hot and redeemable is cheap. Anyway, with that being said, this book was awful. I hated every minute of it. The criticism of the book is 100% valid. From a plot and narrative perspective, it's not good. There's so many holes. The narrative can't decide whether or not Ryle is actually a good person. Everything is contradictory. I gave Colleen Hoover a little bit too much credit by saying like, oh my god, she's expertly writing Lily as an unreliable narrator because she's going through her trauma and can't really process that she is experiencing it. But then later on, she never actually confronts any of the things that she said or any of the false pretenses that she was making her decisions based on. So craft-wise, this book is awful. Narrative-wise, this book is awful. Character-wise, this book is awful. And of course, overall message-wise, this book is awful. So with that being said, that's the end of the video. Don't check out Colleen Hoover. Don't read her books. You don't have to. If you want to rot your brain, scroll on TikTok for hours on end. It would be more productive than reading a Colleen Hoover book. And if you want to rot your brain, you can follow me on all my social media at Variations of Listen to Kristen on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Anyway, that's the end of the video. My throat hurts. It's hard work being a hater for 2.5 hours. That's it. I'm done. I hate this book, but I did it for the content.